It was on this day in 1974 that Brian Clough was sacked as Leeds manager. And in the spirit of failures, I'm going to talk about the American players at Leeds. Or maybe that's a little bit harsh. It's not just the players, it was also the manager, Jesse Marsh. But if you've been a Leeds fan for the last couple of decades, you're pretty familiar with failure. So why is this failure, this particular failure of the American players and manager, so unique? And when I say unique, I mean hated to a almost untold degree by Leeds fans. As an American myself, not a Canadian, despite some of the insidious rumors that are circulating around the internets, I'm here as Leeds United's resident Benedict Arnold to talk you through a little bit as to why the acerbic feelings coming from Leeds United fans seem to be more directed at the failing American players as opposed to one of the other 16 players that have either gone out on loan or been sold this transfer window. But before I get into that, it's important to say that in order to engage with this content thoughtfully and not just all with humor, which, obviously I'm channeling a little bit right now, it's important to remember that we need to acknowledge that the American players were a failure here. Absolutely. So was the American manager. However, there's a generous amount of failure to go around last season, and it's not all the American players' fault. In fact, I would say it's not even mostly their fault. But there's a reason for the anger amongst Leeds United fans that centers around these American players and manager. I'm going to talk about it now. So let's cue the intro. Let's do it.
Okay, fine. I guess I'll do the intro. I've got to be clear in my communication and my commitment and of what I'm asking my guys to do. The beautiful Gabe. Wait, no, that's not right. It's the beautiful Gabe. Beautiful Game football show. Is that Gabe, the American, that Leeds United fan? Oh my God, no. Starring Gabe, the American. What a prick. Best known for his dubious French crop hairstyle and uninspiring vinyl collection, a deep and frankly strange love for the city of Grimsby, and suspicious loyalties to Leeds and, is that a Wales flag on the back of a fat face top? Good Lord. All about the beautiful game of soccer. That's right, I'm an AI bot and I'm supposed to call it football. Like and subscribe, I guess, or don't. What do I care? You'll never see my face again.
If you've been on Twitter at all or haven't been living under a rock in the Leeds United fandom, you would have noticed that the American players are getting a little bit more anger from the Leeds United faithful than some of the other loanees and transfer departures. And if you don't agree with this, you're not going to enjoy the video, so maybe just go. But before you do, remember to like and subscribe because I need that algorithm green. But if you have noticed this, and I think you probably have if you're in this space, maybe you're wondering why. You probably have your own theories and thoughts, so put them in the comment section below. But I'm going to give you my opinion here as to why I think this is the case. But before we can talk about the American players, we have to talk about the American manager, Jesse Marsh. But before we talk about Jesse Marsh, we have to talk about the owner, Andre Radrizzani. Former owner, I should say. Good riddance, Raz. And when we talk about Radrizzani, we also have to talk about Victor Orta. But before we talk about those guys, we have to talk about the biggest kingpin at Leeds United since Don Revie. That is Marcelo Bielsa. Now, if you're not from the city of Leeds or you're not an actual Leeds United fan and you're tuning into this randomly because you like my face or hate it, could be both, you may not necessarily understand who Marcelo Bielsa was to Leeds United. So let's break this down a little bit through a metaphor. Imagine for a minute that you're a child and you've gone through a series of nannies and none of them have worked out. And your father and mother, Mr. and Mrs. Banks, hire someone called Mary Poppins who is fantastic and revolutionizes your life. But after a little while, Mary Poppins goes to Mr. and Mrs. Banks and says, hey, we need more resources to continue this upward trajectory. And Mr. Banks says, no. And Mrs. Banks doesn't know what's going on. And ultimately, the magic of Mary Poppins starts to wear off a little bit because, Mr. Banks didn't give her what she was asking for. This metaphor is breaking down already. So Mr. Banks gets rid of Mary Poppins and then launches a search for a new, caretaker? Is it nanny? There it is, a new nanny. And Mr. Banks tells the kids, hey, listen, we have a successor to Mary Poppins. Mary Poppins 2.0. It's going to take us to the next level. And it's Mrs. Doubtfire. Now listen, again, this metaphor is really chaotic and messy and probably not applicable. But I understand that Mrs. Doubtfire was like a good nanny for a while. But in this metaphor, we're just going to focus on the fact that Mrs. Doubtfire isn't actually a real person. I also know that Mrs. Doubtfire is actually the father of the kids. Let's pretend that's not the case in the film. And let's just say that it's some guy pretending to be a nanny. Because that's basically what Jesse Marsh was in terms of playing style. He was not a natural tactical successor to Marcelo Bielsa at all. The only tactical similarity I think they have is that they both employ high press systems. And if that's what you think football tactics are, it's just, oh, this person presses and so do they. It's the same. Then You don't need a huge imagination to figure out why Leeds went down. So anyway, Mrs. Doubtfire gets hired. Things seem good for a while. She says all the right things, but in the end, ultimately, she's just kind of a fraud. I don't want to bag too much on Jesse Marsh here. He was always going to have a difficult job, and I don't want to spend a whole video talking about why Jesse Marsh failed because I'd be here for hours. But I do want to say a couple things before we launch into the American players about Jesse Marsh. If you're coming in to replace a club legend, right, it might be a good idea to not criticize the club legend. Maybe don't do that. Whether it's true or not, maybe just keep that to yourself. And this is a big problem with Jesse. He talked a lot. He criticized Marcelo Bielsa for overtraining the players. He claimed Junior Firpo was the best passer of the ball in the entire squad. He claimed Liam Cooper was the best captain he'd ever seen in world football. Listen, no disrespect to Liam Cooper, but that kind of hyperbole gets you in trouble if everything is the best you've ever seen. This sandwich is the best I've ever eaten. This bean pie at Ellen Road that stuck to the wall is the best bean pie that's ever been stuck to any wall ever. This stadium is the best stadium I've ever seen. That was the kind of stuff that came out of Jesse Marsh's mouth every time he talked. And he talked a lot. He gave interview after interview. He was on Talk Sport. He was on Peacock Network. He was on ESPN. He was writing columns during the World Cup break. This is just a theme that went on and on and on. And Marcelo Bielsa, on the other hand, when he talked, he was giving you like a tactical masterclass and a presentation. Now, I'm not saying that Marsh should have gone in and tried to be Bielsa, but if we remember back, and by remember I mean consult history, because very few of us that are watching this video were around back then, or at least around in the sense that they would have remembered it and engaged with it as a fan. When Brian Clough came in after Don Revie, he did a lot of criticizing of the players and told them to chuck all their medals and titles into the bin. Maybe not the best way to make an impression. And Brian Clough is one of the best managers to ever do it in the game of football. Jesse Marsh is not. And it's not anti-American to say that. It's not mean. It's not mean-spirited. It's just a fact. Now, let's go back to the Mary Poppins metaphor for a second. Remember how Mr. Banks told Mary Poppins that she couldn't have the resources she needed to keep things going? Well, then imagine that Mr. Banks gives the successor, Mrs. Doubtfire, all the money she needs and then some to retool the chest. Saying to retool the chest about Mrs. Doubtfire has a very literal meaning in terms of money spent, so maybe I'm going to abandon this metaphor now. The point is that they gave Jesse Marsh 130 million quid. That's right, 130 million pounds. That was the summer spend that Jesse Marsh had. He spent that much money on players in the summer. So you would imagine a team that won 8 games the season before and barely stayed up, they've just spent 130 million pounds. They're going to be a whole lot better. And this is where one problem begets another, begets another, begets another. In my opinion, the real blame for Leeds United going down rests first and foremost with Andrea Radrizzani and Victor Orta. However, third in line has to go to Jesse Marsh because he invested in players that honestly didn't get the job done. Let's look at Jesse Marsh's signings. Number 1, Brendan Aronson. We're talking about the record signing at Leeds United. Now, Brendan Aronson is a young player. He's not old. He's 22 years old. I think he's 22. Maybe he's 23 now. Was he 22 when he signed or 21? I don't remember, but it's young. But the point is, when you come in for a record figure, you're going to have a certain amount of expectations put on you. And if you don't play well and meet those expectations, people are going to get angry. Add to that this player, despite reports that he was scouted by Marcelo Bielsa, is a quintessential Jesse Marsh player, a press merchant out of a Red Bull system. Brendan Aronson was the first and foremost signing of the Marsh era, and I think really typifies everything Jesse Marsh's teams were about in tandem with Victor Orta. Overpaid for this player, and the player underdelivered massively. And that was the case, I think, of pretty much every signing during the Marsh era. Now we can go down the line and look at other players. Maximilian Vober, also an RB Salzburg player, came in less than 20 million pounds, average performances. Rasmus Christensen, 13 million. Very poor. Tyler Adams, 17 million, played well. Jorginho Rutter was another signing. Willie Gnonto obviously overperformed, so I guess that was a win. Marsh famously said that Gnonto wasn't ready for the Premier League. That was wrong. Again, this is another example of Marsh talking when maybe he shouldn't or doesn't have to. It's like in any sport, there are forced errors and unforced errors, and the thing is with Marsh, most of the L's that he took outside of the pitch were things he brought on himself. It's like that meme, no one, absolutely no one, Jesse Marsh says something wild. And In most cities, that isn't going to fly. It's particularly not going to fly in Leeds. If you have something to say in Leeds, make sure it's good. And even if it is, like, maybe don't talk as much. That's something I still haven't learned. So we're going to abandon the metaphor now because it's useless. But we're talking about one of the best managers Leeds United has ever had being replaced by a guy with a dubious background who brings in players to fit his specific system that is untested at the Premier League level. In fact, outside of MLS and the Austrian League, Jesse Marsh's results haven't been particularly good. And that's just kind of an objective fact, guys. It comes without, personal feeling or sentiment whatsoever. So Marsh comes in, replaces a club legend, says a bunch of stuff that gets him in trouble with the fans, and then ultimately brings in a bunch of his guys from a system that's unproven and untested. And some of these guys happen to be Americans. So you can imagine that anything that's sort of associated with Jesse Marsh is going to get an extra amount of vitriol if it doesn't work out. Guess what? It didn't work out. Now, we could sit here and debate till the cows come home about whether or not Leeds would have gotten one more win than they did with Marsh and maybe stayed up. But the fact of the matter is the team wasn't good enough. The team they have in the championship now is better than the team that Marsh put together. And remember, Marsh had a core group of Bielsa players that I think should have been moved on a while ago. And it turns out Bielsa himself said some of those players needed to get moved on. They spent £130 million on pedestrian players from a untested system that at its best dominates a league without a lot of competition. When you combine that with a player pool that has no world-class talent, who lost Calvin Phillips, lost Rafinha, lost Stuart Dallas for the foreseeable past, present, and future, and had some players who were clearly past it and weren't going to be able to perform as well as they did under Bielsa. Maybe ever again. Definitely never again. Combine that again with fitness issues that are recurring with some of the most important players, then you have a recipe for disaster. So that's Jesse Marsh. But Jesse Marsh got sacked, you say. There's plenty of time for another manager to dig this team out. That's part of the issue. Now, I agree, a better manager might have gotten a better tune out of some of those players. But remember that this team is assembled to play a style the way Jesse Marsh wants them to play. Brendan Aronson, with some development, may turn into a fair player. I personally don't think so. I rate him more as a low-table Bundesliga player who's in a squad rotation in that scenario. Definitely not a Premier League player, in my opinion. It's just my opinion. It's nothing personal. I just don't see him as that player. I think there are some things that are improvable with players and some things that aren't. And the biggest holes in Brendan Aronson's game, in my opinion, should have been ironed out in early development stage, and they weren't. So this is who he is. And if that weren't bad enough, let's talk about the last player to come in as part of Marsh's machine, and that is Weston McKennie. Now, for me, Weston McKennie perfectly sums up the issue that Leeds fans have with these American players. McKennie came in with a lot of club pedigree. He played a ton of matches for Juventus. You can't do that if you're not good at some football stuff. And when he came in, he played next to Tyler Adams. I think it was against Manchester United, and he looked really good. There were memes flying around the internet of the Bash brothers from the Mighty Ducks, because that's what it looked like with those two. They were getting really stuck into tackles, were getting up in the faces of the Manchester United players. Ellen Road fans loved that particularly. I think at early days, first days, it looked like this was going to be a match made in heaven. And then something terrible happened. Tyler Adams went down with an injury, and he'd be out for the rest of the season. So that dream of seeing McKennie play next to Tyler Adams and free up Mark Rocca in a 4-3-3, which was something that many Leeds United fans were looking forward to, never happened. On top of that, you add that Weston McKennie didn't look particularly fit when he came in. Now, if you don't follow the men's national team or McKennie's career in general, and why would you as a Leeds fan, you wouldn't necessarily know that that's just the guy's physique. It doesn't mean he's not fit or that he can't run. It's just the way he is. Additionally, when you look at McKennie's career, there have been questions about his professionalism, his off-field, not behavior per se, although that was called into question in one U.S. men's national team camp, but really more of how he takes care of himself, his diet, how serious he is, things like that. So whereas he is a player that shows flashes of excellent play, like in international play and for Juventus, at Leeds United, although it started well, his performances fell off pretty drastically. Now, there are some other things that happened on Twitter, and I'm not going to name the guy because honestly, I don't want to engage with this whole lot. There was a certain personality on Twitter that claimed to have direct inside knowledge to not only McKennie, but the other U.S. players, and started saying a lot of really slanderous stuff about Leeds United, about the city, about the other players, about the club, and it did not help McKennie. Now, Weston McKennie ultimately came out and said, hey, guys, if stuff doesn't come from me, then it's not how I feel. That being said, I thought that was too little too late, and it really tarnished McKennie's reputation. So at that point, things kind of came to a head, and I think everything sort of exploded for Leeds United in the Crystal Palace match. This was a match that Leeds United didn't just lose, but they got thoroughly embarrassed, and from there, the club was in free fall. By this time, Jesse Marsh had been sacked. There were a couple matches under Scubala, and then Javi Grazia came in and seemed to right the ship. You had a midfield of Rocca and McKennie, with Adams being out, that played really well against Nottingham Forest. At the time, it didn't seem that impressive, but Nottingham Forest stayed up when we didn't. But match after match, we got pelted, we were overrun in the midfield, and honestly, Leeds fans had enough. Ultimately, Javi Grazia was sacked and Sam Allardyce was brought in too little too late, and Leeds went down. And when you really look at it, it's a series of bad decisions that stacked kind of vertically on top of each other, and it put a lot of direct pressure on the club and the city. When you invest in a guy like Jesse Marsh, when you give him 130 million quid to spend, and he buys all his RB players, and then a midfielder that is more of a Swiss Army knife than an actual specialty blade. Think about this for a minute. If you're cutting a steak, do you want a Swiss Army knife or a steak knife? If you're clearing brush in the jungle, do you want a machete or do you want a Swiss Army knife? There's nothing against Swiss Army knives. They're useful. They're utility knives. They do a bunch of cool things. But if you need a specific job done, the Swiss Army knife is probably not the best tool. And unfortunately, Weston McKennie, in the context of a Jesse Marsh system, was kind of a Swiss Army knife player, a utility guy that could be deployed in a number of different ways. But if you need him to sit in a double pivot in a 4-2-3-1, he's not your guy. If you need him to play next to a midfielder that isn't going to cover a ton of ground like Tyler Adams does, he's probably not your guy. And when you add the stuff that was happening on the internet, when you add just the sentiment about Brendan Aronson, how much money was spent on him, and then you add to the mix that there's this 49ers group, this American investment group, that there at the time it was sort of unclear where the investment was going to go. I think it kind of homogenized the frustration on behalf of Leeds United's fans, and it was easy to direct it at the American players. The fact of the matter is that everybody was poor last season. The core Bielsa players stunk. The other signings that were Jesse Marsh signings stunk. But think about it this way. If you're playing on a team that stinks and then and the coach brings like his kids in, and for better or for worse, that is how the American players were perceived in England. Sort of as, if it weren't for Jesse Marsh, they wouldn't be here. Now, I don't think that's necessarily fair. Again, McKennie was a Juventus player. Tyler Adams did play well. It's become sort of popular and in vogue to pretend that Tyler Adams wasn't good for us last season. I don't buy into that at all. And then, of course, Brendan Aronson was really, really not good. Had some positive signs in the beginning of the season, but it didn't work out. It's not dishonest to say that the American players failed. They did. And now here's one last point I want to make in terms of what makes Leeds United fans really angry, and that is USMNT Twitter accounts. The first good World Cup the United States had in the modern era was 1994, and it wasn't even that good. Like, they got out of the group stage. 1998 was a disaster. 2002, they got to the quarterfinals and probably should have progressed against Germany. 2006, they were eliminated in the group stage. 2010, they were eliminated by Ghana after the group stage. 2014, eliminated in the quarterfinal. 2018, didn't qualify. 2022, got out of the group stage and did not progress after that. So one cannot say that the United States is like this world power in football, but they are a nation on the rise. And what's accompanied that is a higher interest in football, not just in the domestic league of MLS, but mostly, and this is, I think, hard for some people to understand, most of what is consumed in terms of football in the United States isn't MLS. American fans watch the Premier League, they watch La Liga, they watch the Bundesliga, they watch Serie A, they watch Liga MX. They watch that a whole lot more than sometimes they watch MLS. And there isn't this huge historical precedent for lots of Americans playing abroad. As a result, there were a lot of Americans that tuned into Leeds matches just to see how the American players got on. And unlike fans of a club who are going to criticize the players if they're not playing well because they're worried about what's going to happen to their club, some of these USMNT accounts were defending American players when they shouldn't have been defended, or engaging this whataboutism, or criticizing Leeds United as a club to try to make the American players look better. I'm kind of in the middle on this, whereas I don't think it's the American players' fault singularly that we got relegated. It absolutely played a factor in. It's pretty clear to me that Brendan Aronson wasn't good last season. I'm a little bit more 50-50 on Weston McKennie because I've seen better performances for him throughout his career, and it's pretty clear he didn't perform well for Leeds. However, there's some extensive reporting out there stateside that McKennie was given assurances that Jesse Marsh wasn't on the chopping block, which is why he came to Leeds in the first place. And then to have him sacked, like I think it was like a week after he got there, maybe it was a couple days, That's got to be pretty harrowing. That being said, though, Leeds is where you were at, and you have to do better, and he didn't. I think some of the abuse he got was excessive, but I think the majority of Leeds fans who have a head on their shoulders were criticizing the player in a non-personal way. It was just more about the performances, and they saw a character that didn't care too much. And I don't know McKennie. I have no insight into his point of view, but I wouldn't be surprised if he was just thinking, get me out of here. And as a supporter of Leeds United myself, that's not good enough for me. That's never going to fly. You have to care about the club if you're going to be here. Or as Liam Cooper said politely, So it was kind of a perfect storm, and I think that it reinforced some negative stereotypes people had about American players. And one thing I'm going to say is I don't think American players or fans should be concerned about stereotypes. I think they should just be themselves. I'm not going to get on here and defend myself as an American every time someone says something anti-American. I could care less. There are 350 million people in the United States. So we don't have to answer for all of them. That being said, I do think there's some over-scapegoating of the American players, but it has to be said that the American players were an unmitigated failure. And before you stop and say, well, Tyler Adams played well, Tyler Adams only played half the season. So whereas his performances weren't failing performances, the overarching theme of his season was failure because he wasn't there for half of it. So therefore, it's not disingenuous to say that Tyler Adams' season wasn't a success, that the club was relegated, he was hurt, and ultimately he forced his way out of the club and went to Bournemouth. As an American, I of course want our players to play well, but I'm a Leeds United fan first. And ultimately, Leeds United is a side before self club. If you don't embody those values, you're going to get stick from the fans. All in all, I think Leeds fans are going to lump those players in with Jesse Marsh and say if we had never hired Marsh, none of this would have happened and maybe we'd still be in the Premier League. And we don't necessarily know that they're wrong. All this to say that I'm glad this is over, and I'm glad I don't have to answer any more questions about current American players at Leeds because, frankly, that gets really annoying. Last season, I heard all the time about how they thought the 49ers would stick with Marsh no matter what because he was an American. And it turns out the 49ers wanted Marsh out early. The idea that Americans value nationalism in teams and wink, wink, nudge, nudge, let's do each other a favor, jobs for the boys, that's not really how we work. We're like capitalism on steroids over here, guys. If anything, I've seen more of that tribalism in England. The English FA going out with a guy like Gareth Southgate right now, in lieu of hiring a world-class manager because, he's going to do what they tell him to do and he's English. It's pretty silly. The fact that Sam Allardyce got that job in the first place and lasted, a couple months, I think? I don't know. I didn't do the research on that, but I remember Big Sam got fired pretty quickly. He shouldn't have been anywhere near that job. And in fact, I did hear a very small minority of Leeds fans, even in the content creating community, when Javi Gracia came in, they were talking about, he's going to do real well with Rocca because that Spanish connection. Doesn't really make a lot of sense, guys. Just because somebody hails from the same country doesn't mean that he's going to want somebody to succeed more. I don't know. It's just a very weird kind of line of logic that I don't quite understand. And whereas I know that those USMNT accounts want the American players to succeed, that's because they're fans of the national team. And that's what they do. There are so many American owners throughout English and European football. It's ridiculous. And most of them have no Americans in their team anywhere near management. So the idea that the Americans are going to come in and bring a bunch of substandard American players, I think this is sort of a weird, I don't even know what to describe it. It's a very strange phenomenon I've noticed amongst England fans. And by England fans, I mean fans in England, not fans of the England team, because it's sort of a national pastime to hate your national team there more than cheer for it, which is odd. So anyway, to review, unmitigated failure for the American players, unmitigated failure for Jesse Marsh, and ultimately Leeds are in the championship. A lot of things went wrong last season. They've been analyzed to 10 buck 2. I'm not going to do it again, but I think some Leeds United fans needed to hear acknowledgement from an American that the American players failed without trying to justify that failure. So there it is. You have it. I'm sure the USMNT fans are going to come for me eventually. Also, what was the deal with Jesse Marsh and those jeans? Watching him remonstrate on the touchline when we beat Chelsea, while it was a great moment for the club, it turns out anybody could beat Chelsea that season, it was very uncomfortable for me.